Hello, it's your friendly neighborhood host, JT Wheatley, back again for another episode of the History of Comics podcast, this time with the first part of the life of Carl Barks, the good duck artist. I'm giving away my age here, but like many kids growing up in the late 80s and early 90s, one of my favorite things to do after school was turn on the TV and catch the Disney Afternoon, headlined by DuckTales and followed by such other classic cartoons like Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, Tailspin, and my personal favorite, Darkwing Duck. At the time, I didn't care who created them and even naturally assumed they were all just made by Walt Disney himself, as the company actually wanted you to believe. It was only years later that I learned that while the late great Walt Disney did create Donald Duck, the core of DuckTales had its origins not in cartoons but in comic books under Carl Barks, who created Uncle Scrooge, the Beagle Boys, Gyro Gyroos, and many of the stories that inspired the series. It wasn't just that, though, as Barks' comic book work would reach 22 million readers every month, creating 500 comic book stories, 6,000 pages of art, and countless covers, with no less than Walt Disney's brother Roy E. Disney calling him the comic book king. However, he would never be acknowledged during his career, along with other great Disney artists like Floyd Gottfredson, who drew the Mickey Mouse comic strip for 45 years because Disney Studios only wanted you to believe that Walt Disney signed all his name to their products. It would only be after his retirement that Carl Barks would finally receive the acclaim he so richly deserved. Carl Barks was born on March 27, 1901 in Merrill, Oregon, to William Barks and Amamita Johnson, preceded 2 years earlier by his brother Clyde. Their father, William, was born on March 4, 1858, while their mother, Amamita, was born on March 15, 1860. Barks originally grew up on a 1-mile square lot that served as the family farm. Barks would describe growing up as a rather lonely child, with the nearest neighbor a half-mile away, while he had to walk to school 2 miles away every day. Barks did have high praise for his school, which was a 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., but when he got home, he had no one to talk to, as he had little in common with his older brother. Plus, he had chores to keep him busy, such as bedding down trucks with straw. In 1908, Barks' family moved to Midland, Oregon to venture into the feedlot business, serving nearby slaughterhouses. It was a bit of a culture shock for Carl and his brother Clyde, as they were not used to the crowds at the marketplace, and Barks was especially intrigued by the cowboys, with their strange slang and sense of humor. The family became successful enough in this venture that they would briefly move to Santa Rosa, California from 1911 to 1912, where they set about cultivating vegetables and setting up orchards. However, this wasn't as successful, causing financial difficulties for the family, along with his father, William, having his first nervous breakdown. After he recovered, the Barks family moved back to Midland. Growing up, despite his farming life, Barks loved reading comic strips, especially those by Hal Foster. He particularly loved Prince Valiant, Winsor McCay, whose Little Nimoy was the first comic book he ever remembered reading, Roy Crane, Wally Wood, Alex Raymond, Ross Manning, and Billy DeBeck. By 16, Barks wanted to be a cartoonist himself, though he wasn't as a fan of superheroes. He also loved creative illustrations by Andrew Loomis, while Fenimore Cooper, who wrote The Last of the Mohicans, was his favorite author. However, in 1916, Carl Barks was forced to drop out of school at the 8th grade at the age of 15 when his mother died. This was further influenced by Barks' developing long-time hearing problems, for which he would later need a hearing aid for, that made it hard for him to understand his teachers. Plus, the nearest high school was 5 miles away, thus at this point it was best just to work on the farm. Barks ended up ending his education to be a disappointment, though in 1917 he did enroll in the Landon Correspondence School of Cartooning, but quit after just a few lessons, though he would later credit it with helping him improve his drawing style. By 1918, Barks moved to San Francisco to work at a print shop, but failed to sell any of his cartoons to the papers. He also did posters for streetcars for $12.50 a week, though. He then returned to Oregon in 1920 to work at his father's ranch. This constant drifting between jobs would later influence his later comic book stories, especially with how Donald Duck kept getting a different job from one issue to the next. Growing up, Barks was influenced by two things: physical labor and his lack of formal education. The former he was familiar with his earliest jobs working on a ranch or in the railroads, while the latter would push him to further his education in numerous fields, from geography, mythology, history, and even English grammar. Both will influence his comic book work, and particularly what he did with Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge. Another influence would be his developing a sense of humor with his fellow laborers, as due to this and their hard lives, they couldn't find a way of life without it, or as he would state, they would go insane. This, of course, would influence his later comic book work as well. Carl Barks got married in 1921 to Pearl Turner and had children, both of which he said was way too young, as his wife, he was just 20 and his wife was 16. Their first daughter, Peggy, was born on January 23, 1923, and in 1924 their second daughter, Dorothy, was born. To support his growing family, Barks started working as a railroad riveter for 6.5 years, and by 1929 he moved to Rosalie, California to do so, while still trying at cartooning. However, his marriage fell apart when he discovered his wife was cheating on him. According to Barks, he had the gall to pick up their kids with her boyfriend at their school. He separated from Pearl in 1930, which forced Barks to return to Oregon, where he began drawing cartoons, joking it was easier way to make a living. From 1928 to 1929, Barks started to sell gags to College Humor, Captain Billy's Whiz Bang Judge, and the Calgary Eye Opener. In 1931, Carl Barks moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota to work at the Eye Opener, a racy men's cartoon magazine, where he would meet his second wife, Clara Balkin, a telephone operator whom he would later marry in 1938. From 1932 to 1935, Carl Barks became the editor and their sole contributor to the Eye Opener. However, in 1935, Carl Barks went to Disney Studios for 1 month of training that November at $15 a week, starting as an in-betweener that December for $20 a week. By coincidence, Donald Duck, a character who would make a huge impact on Barks' life and vice versa, made his debut that year on June 9, 1934 in the animated short The Wise Little Hen. Their destinies will soon be intertwined. For 6 months between 1935 and 1936, Carl Barks left to start work at Disney Studios, becoming an in-betweener or someone who draws the action frames between the key poses of animation, thus giving the illusion of movement. In 1936, he animated Mickey Mouse in the sequence Through the Mirror, while submitting various gags for animated cartoons and comic strips. Among these was the gag for Donald Duck's Modern Inventions, which depicted Donald Duck getting a haircut in an automatic chair while his beak was shined. This was done on the advice of Ted Shears, the first head of Disney's story department, who said Barks should do action gags over plot gags. Walt Disney was personally impressed, pointing out Barks and his animation unit for its work and paying him $50. The short would debut with the chair gag on May 29, 1937, and remains one of the classic cartoons of Disney's early animation era. Barks also loved doing The Good Scouts with Harry Rees, which got them $300 from Walt Disney. This got Barks moved to the story department, where he was the lead storyman of Donald Duck cartoons, who got his own unit in 1937 from 1936 to 1942, working out of Burbank, where he focused mostly on 36 Donald Duck cartoons, except for one Pluto cartoon, working alongside fellow animator and future Disney legend Jack Hanna. Some notable cartoons that Barks worked on during this era was Donald's Nephews on April 15, 1938, which debuted Huey, Dewey, and Louie in animation, along with another set of characters Barks would have a huge influence on, and Donald's Cousin Gus on May 3, 1939. In addition, he married Clara Barkin in 1938 and reunited with his daughters, whom he had been separated from since 1931, for all of them going on a trip throughout southern United States. Carl Barks personally praised Walt Disney, calling him hardworking and a genius, though a bit unpredictable. Barks also points out that the Great Depression was good for Walt Disney Studios, as it made a lot of artists and animators available for work. As history has shown, the Depression was good for the film business in general, as movies were a cheap form of entertainment at the time, and audiences flocked to fill the theaters. By 1940, Carl Barks moved to San Luis Jonita, California, to be near the new Disney Studios in Burbank, which had just opened on May 6th, working out of his own studio. In 1941, he did not participate in the Disney strike that lasted from May 29th to September 14th, like the rest of the members of the story department. In addition, Barks stated he was actually against the strike, as he felt that workers were well treated at Disney Studios with good salaries and a loose work schedule, allowing them to come and go as they pleased as long as they finished their assignments. However, he would be hit by two blows when his father died and Carl Barks needed to move for a drier climate, as the air conditioning at the studio ruined his sinuses. Before quitting in 1942, Carl Barks managed to lay the groundwork for his future, as he moonlighted as a comic book artist doing the Pluto Shaves the Ship and Dell Comics, Large Feature Comics number 7, and then Donald Duck Finds the Pirate's Gold and Dell Comics 4-Color Comics number 9 that October. The latter was initially intended as a full-length movie, but ended up being his first comic book story, along with being some of the first Disney comic books in general. He got help from his animation partner Jack Hanna, who illustrated one half of the 64-page comic. It was the first Donald Duck comic produced for America and involved an adventure of Donald Duck and his nephews looking for the legendary pirate Henry Morgan's lost treasure. After leaving animation and before becoming a full-time comic book artist, Carl Barks would try chicken farming in Hamlet, San Quinta, a semi-desert part of the inland east of Los Angeles on November 6, 1942, ideal for relieving his sinus condition. While this venture wasn't successful, it would inspire one of Carl Barks' favorite stories in Walt Disney Comics and Stories number 146, November 1952, in which Donald Duck tells the story of a chain of unfortunate events that occurred when he owned a chicken farm in a town called Omelette, once again using real life for his work. With the chicken farmer failure, Carl Barks started trying to get into some comic book work. Around the same time, Western Publishing started a new 10-page Donald Duck series in Walt Disney's Comics and Stories, and when Carl Barks inquired for work, they sent him a script for one of the stories. Seeing his chance, Barks drastically rewrote the story he was assigned to illustrate, called The Victory Garden, which first appeared in issue number 31 that November, and with issue number 32, Barks drew his first complete Donald Duck story on December 23rd. It was the beginning of a long and brilliant comic book career. From 1942 to 1966, Barks would write, draw all but 30 of the 10-page Donald Duck stories in Walt Disney Comics and Stories, working on 256 out of 286 issues, 9 of which were just reprints of Barks' original work. Outside of Disney, Carl Barks produced comics for Western Publishing like Andy Parade and Porky Pig from 1943 to 1947. It was during this time he met his third and final wife, Margaret Garr Williams. From 1943 to 1967, Carl Barks would write and draw Donald Duck Adventures, all 36 stories, at 22 to 33 pages apiece. And in 1945, Claire Delps helped with the inking. He did a single Mickey Mouse story, The Riddler and the Red Hat, in 1945 for 4-Color Comics number 79, which is submitted on the 27th of April. All in all, Carl Barks is now a full-time comic book artist, but he was about to truly change history with Disney and Donald Duck in particular when he was about to introduce his uncle, Scrooge McDuck. And with that, we will conclude with this first part of the life of Carl Barks, the good duck artist. But join me again next week where we get into the creation of Scrooge, not only Scrooge McDuck, but many of the other numerous characters that Carl Barks created around Donald Duck's family that truly shaped his stories and all that came afterwards. And now is December 17th, 2020, time for the favorite comic of the week. We Only Find Them When We're Dead, number 4 by Al Ewing and Simone DeMeo, which finds George and his crew battling with Paula, who has a personal grudge against George, all in the presence of a living god that they finally been searching for. This remains another great science fiction series with some great epic tension. Al Ewing really keeps it at the razor's edge, especially as George makes a surprising decision in the presence of a living god he's been searching for most of his life. All while DeMeo's art is epic and haunting at the same time. I mean, you have this giant god in speaking in their presence, but you also forget that there's the haunting blackness of space. And as you're looking at science, which is something I love with how this book looks, is that when you get out into space, it's just supposedly supposed to be this hauntingly black. There's just nothing out there. So I just love the look of this book. The art is just absolutely gorgeous. And this remains one of the best science fiction comic book series in recent memory. So yeah, definitely pick it up if you like some good old-fashioned hardcore science fiction there. But yeah, that's the favorite comic book of the week. And till then, join me again next week for the second part of the great life of Carl Barks, the good duck artist. Till then, go out and enjoy yourself a good comic book.